Both the Great Depression and the Great Recession had catastrophic effects on individuals across the world. But how did the media and newspapers play a role in the effects, and was the coverage of these events similar? The Great Depression was an economic depression that began on October 29, 1929, with a stock market crash. Factors that contributed to the depression were a decline in consumer spending, bank failures, and more. Newspapers during the 1930s heavily focused on the economic strife that the public faced. Coverage of Black Tuesday featured discussion of plummeting stocks despite the efforts of bankers who were trying to work against one of the busiest days on Wall Street in history. Bank runs contributed to the depression and were people's way of attempting to protect themselves from the economic perils the country was facing. Newspapers showed the public what was real during this time: fear, confusion, and desperation. Another reality was the American people thought a change in leadership would lead to economic prosperity. FDR became president in 1933 in a landslide victory, and soon after he implemented the New Deal. Newspapers covered his fireside chats and even included text from the broadcasts. If people missed the broadcast, reading the published text was an easy way to learn the information. The Great Recession was a sharp decline in economic activity from 2007 to 2009. The U.S. housing market busted, and a large amount of mortgage-backed securities lost significant value. Much of the coverage during the recession was from the perspective of the Obama administration and big businesses. American citizens' voices were not as involved as these institutions, even though everyday Americans were those who suffered the most. According to the Pew Research Center, there were three main storylines featured in papers in 2008. These storylines were efforts to help the reviving banking sector, the battle over the stimulus package, and the struggles of the U.S. auto industry. 40% of economic coverage involved these topics. Only 2% of all economic coverage reported on retail sales, food prices, the impact of the crisis on Social Security and Medicare, and more issues directly related to the general public in terms of their well-being and financial stability. There are clear parallels between the coverage of the Depression and the Recession. Heavy focus on the change in leadership was the most common similarity covered. The people voted not only for a change in the person in 1932 and 2008, but also a change in the party in power. There are more differences in the coverage. First, the type of media used. In 1930s, the main media coverage of the Depression was through newspapers. By 2007, the internet was a strong medium for journalism, so coverage was both online and in print. Second, the type of coverage was different. The Depression heavily focused on how economic peril affected the people, whereas recession covered focused on institutions. Lastly, because the recession was after the Depression, there was much comparison to the past. Many stories referred back to the Depression, which brought fear to Americans. From this comparison, we can see that journalists and the media changed greatly from the 1930s to 2007. The change shows how much the government and big business has become increasingly more powerful in the U.S. Not only do they impact how economic downturns play out, but they influence how people learn about this situation. Through both economic hardships, journalists served as important communicators that informed the public and held institutions accountable.